International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Massive sanctions, mass migration, evacuations, and peace talks, as well as the most militaristic movements from the European Union in its short history. These are some of the major developments that have been occurring as a result and surrounding the Russo-Ukrainian war. Now, our main story today is going to focus on the peace talks occurring between the Ukrainian and Russian delegation on the Belarusian border. We're going to focus on whether or not these peace talks can actually develop in what their goal is, a ceasefire, the continuation of diplomatic resolutions, and essentially creating some form of, at the very least, temporary peace in this war. We're also going to focus on the demands that are being made by Russia and Ukraine, or in the specific case of Russia, the lack of actual demands. Now, while these peace talks are the main focus of our story and what I want to convey to you the most today, there are so many other things to cover. Now, keep in mind, this has been the largest land invasion in Europe and the largest war in Europe since World War II, when the entire continent was at a massive war, the entire world really. And because of this, many repercussions that are both global, local, and continental have been felt. The war has only been occurring for 4 days, which is a small amount of time, but a massive amount of developments have been had in those 4 days. Now, first and foremost, it should be stated what we talked about in our last report, is the question if whether or not Russia is losing this war. Now, that at the time was the case, and currently right now it still seems to be the case. Now, Russian soldiers and forces, when they entered Ukraine, it can be assumed, and what some intelligence reports believe, is that the goal and the entire basis of the operation was to have the capital city of Ukraine, Kiev, as well as other major cities in the country, such as Kharkiv and Mariupol, under Russian control within 72 hours. But the reality is that even after 4 days of fighting, all of these major cities have managed to completely hold out. Specifically Kyiv, where Russian soldiers have only managed to encamp roughly 20 miles or 30 kilometers outside of the capital city. Any attempts to get closer or to clear a military path for these soldiers to enter in have been met by major Ukrainian resistance, both by the official military services of the country and by civilians acting in the form of militias. Now, it should also be noted that the casualty count is almost embarrassing. Now, I do want to state that I am not making light of any deaths, even if they are Russian soldiers. These soldiers are just people doing a job, trying to get a paycheck and trying to survive in what is a difficult world, especially in Russia, where the economy is absolutely horrible and based off of an oligarchy where very few people can succeed and live a proper life. Now, these soldiers who have been risking their lives to improve the economic standings of themselves and their families are people just like anyone else. These are people's sons, daughters, husbands, wives, a lot of things, and they mean a lot of things to a lot of individual people. But nonetheless, we do have to evaluate them in a statistical sense. Now, it is estimated that roughly since the beginning of the invasion 4 days ago, 198 Ukrainians have died. The vast majority have been military targets, but that is not to say that some have been civilians. 16 of these 198 casualties are children. And I should state that these casualties are in fact probably much, much larger in reality. It is difficult to document what is going on and to the extent that it's going on. But when you compare the Ukrainian casualties to the amount of Russian soldiers that have been killed in this operation, the numbers are staggering. Now, as I mentioned, it's estimated that a total of 198 Ukrainians have bravely lost their lives in this fight. But at the lowest level, it's estimated that 3,500 Russian soldiers, and at the highest level, 5,000 Russian soldiers have lost their lives in this combat operation. That is a massive amount, an embarrassing amount, an amount that shows that the Russian army was not prepared whatsoever for this invasion, and that the resistance that they face, the logistical problems that they face, and the fuel shortages that they have been facing have caused a complete operational failure. To give you full context of how many soldiers Russia has lost, you need to understand that during the entire occupation of Afghanistan and the peace-building efforts of the United States that lasted almost 20 goddamn years, only 2,491 American soldiers perished in that conflict. Which, yes, that's not a small number, but in 4 days, at least 3,500 Russian soldiers have lost their lives fighting Ukrainians. And it should be noted that many Ukrainians have been bravely fighting back for their homeland. And even those that aren't fighting have been protesting the Russian soldiers marching into villages and cities, putting their lives on the line to demonstrate how they feel about this occupation, even if not necessarily taking up arms. But that is not to say that many Ukrainians, especially those that are heavily invested in their families, or men that are sick or above or below the age to be able to serve their country, and women and children have been evacuating the country. Now, so far, 500,000 Ukrainians have migrated and left the country, at the very least temporarily. The vast majority of these refugees have left to countries like Romania, Hungary, and Moldova, where they have been very graciously welcomed by the leaders of their countries. Because keep in mind that these are not normal migrants that typically come from other countries. These are Europeans that come from a civilized culture and society that has been established for many, many years and typically is not fighting wars. In addition to this, countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and Moldova, who have been accepting a lot of these refugees, view these people as their Slavic brothers. And the reality is that if Russia wins this war and it moves into Ukraine, the countries bordering Ukraine can be next. Now, many of these countries that have been accepting refugees in the hundreds of thousands from Ukraine have been criticized by Arabic rights groups or Islamic human rights groups for not doing the same to Islamic refugees. And it is unfortunate that they did not do this, but some context has to be understood. Now, moving forward, before we get into our main story, which is the peace talks, the most disturbing development that has occurred has been Vladimir Putin and the government of Russia putting their nuclear deployments on high alert. This includes air nuclear deployments, which are long-distance bombers, which could be flying over Ukraine right now. Nuclear submarines and intercontinental ballistic missiles have all been put on high alert, which is the first time in contemporary history that any nation has done this. And it should be noted that Russia is a nuclearly capable nation, threatening Ukraine, which notably is no longer, it used to be, a nuclearly capable nation. And that is a disturbing trend. The United Nations today is holding an Emergency Security Council meeting with the intent of condemning and stopping the war that is occurring in Russia and in Ukraine. But the reality is that this Security Council meeting is probably not going to head into any productive direction. Because, as mentioned before, Russia has a veto vote on the Security Council. In addition to this, its major ally, China, also has a permanent seat, so it can veto this. However, China has not given its full support to Russia, notably trying to maintain its neutrality in the situation. Now, China has more or less supported Russia, and its statements can be construed as such, but its statements can also be construed as relative neutrality. Even China kind of wants to stay out of this conflict. Russia is very, very rapidly losing international friends and making even more powerful international enemies. These foes and rivals have always existed, but they have begun to take a very aggressive stance against Russia. It should be noted that the sanctions introduced by the United States, Europe, Australia, other Asian countries, and many other handfuls of global actors have only been getting more and more severe. They have caused the Russian ruble to almost virtually collapse. The Russian central bank has been scrambling to save and salvage what they can of the nation's currency. Everyday Russians who are feeling the sanctions are going to ATMs and banks to pick up all of the money out of banks that they can, out of fear for sanctions affecting their livelihoods and their financial ability. In addition to this, the United States and Europe are going to begin banning select Russian banks from the international SWIFT system. Now, SWIFT is a complicated system, but just so you understand, it is the primary source for moving large amounts of money from one country to another country from international banks. Banning a nation from SWIFT significantly decreases its ability to interact in the global marketplace. Now, the most major development from this that is occurring outside of Russia and Ukraine has been in the European Union. Now, it should be noted that the European Union was founded after World War II with the very specific intention of preventing future conflicts and wars from breaking out in Europe. And it has relatively been successful at this job, ignoring the wars that have occurred in the Balkans and the war that is occurring right now in Ukraine. The European Union, following its creation, has led to the most peaceful period in European history. And not once has a war or a conflict, an armed conflict, broke out between any EU member states. Now, it should be noted that before the EU was formed, Europe was constantly, endlessly, in some form of major conflict. World War II, World War I, the 100 Years' War, pretty much since the medieval ages, even before then, Europe has always been to war. Typically today, when you think of war, you think of regions like the Middle East or some countries in Africa. But the reality is up until less than 100 years ago, the kings of having wars with each other for sometimes extremely petty reasons were Europeans. Now, the European Union was formed to prevent future wars from breaking out in Europe. And historically, it has taken a very passive stance to global conflicts, never getting militarily involved even at the slightest level, like providing support. This is rapidly changing because of the events in Ukraine. For the first time in its history as a supranational organization and an international body, the European Union has provided lethal weapons to another political actor, in this case, Ukraine. Now, on an individual member state level, Germany has passed a record defense spending bill to beef up its defense capabilities, and many other European Union countries are doing the same. Now, it should be finally be noted that the EU has begun having talks about providing Ukraine with fighter jets, which would bring its military involvement and supply chain management or provisions to Ukraine at an even higher level than the United States, who is the leader of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, that is all contingent on whether or not this conflict continues. And we're finally going to get into the main portion or the main idea of the report that I wanted to convey today, which is the peace talks that are occurring between a Ukrainian and Russian delegation. Now, the question that we're asking, is peace actually possible from these peace talks? And the short answer is no. The long answer is God, no. The reality is that while Ukraine is going into these peace talks with genuine demands and an intention of creating peace, Russia seems to be completely playing them off. And almost, it seems as if Russia is intentionally stalling. Now, Russia has issued a stay order to its soldiers, creating a de facto ceasefire for the very moment. Russian soldiers are stationed but not moving forward, and they have halted their advance while these peace talks are occurring on the Belarusian border. But the reality is these peace talks seem to be a joke. Vladimir Putin's government has not sent the nation's leader. In addition to this, it has not sent the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In fact, the head of the Russian envoy and delegation attending this peace talks is the Russian Minister of Culture. Now, for many Americans and Westerners, ministers of culture that seems like a funny idea. What is a minister of culture? A minister of culture is the cabinet member of any country's government that is in charge of securing and promoting the nation's cultural identity and history. Now, you should note that ministers of culture, generally speaking, are one of the least important ministers of any cabinet government. They fundamentally are. They're typically there just as a political appointment to boost their career. It doesn't really have a lot of influence on the public or the people, nor do ministers of culture actually hold any specific amount of actual power. What has been sent to the Ukrainian delegation to have potential talks with them to end this conflict has essentially been a postal worker. Now, the reality is because of this, the Minister of Culture not only lacks the authority and the auspices of any higher office, they actually do not have the ability to make any concrete promises to Ukraine. And finally, while Ukraine has entered these talks with very clear demands, number one being an immediate and official ceasefire between Ukrainian and Russian forces, and number two being the full and immediate withdrawal of all Russian soldiers from Ukraine. Now, Russia has not come into these talks with any demands whatsoever. So these talks are probably not going to develop into anything productive. And as soon as they are over, fighting is going to commence. Now, the reality is I personally do believe that this is just an act of stalling by the Russian government to allow the military to regroup. As I stated at the beginning of this report, the Russian assault on Ukraine has been a catastrophe for the Russians, losing countless amounts of soldiers and making very little gains. The Russians, notably at the beginning of their offensive, attempted a form of modern blitzkrieg, a shock and awe campaign of using aerial attacks, ground forces, tanks, armored personnel carriers, pretty much every single asset in the Russian military to attack Ukraine, along with cyber attacks to disrupt the organizational abilities of the Ukrainian military. These tactics were not effective, and Russia has stalled itself. The military has to sit back and create a new strategy if it intends to make any gains in Ukraine. In order to do that, it needs a period of time to catch its breath and completely change its tactics. Sitting down and having these talks with Russia, period, is a waste of time. And it's allowing the Ukrainian leadership to fall into a trap. Now, hopefully, I'm in the wrong. And hopefully, if I am right, Ukraine's militias, and I know many people who have been fighting in the Territorial Defense Force are actually listening to my podcast, and I'm honored that you are. If you're listening to this, stay prepared, because this is just a tactic to bring Ukraine's guard down, while Russia regroups and attacks in a different manner. Now, hopefully, even after this stalling, the Russian military is not able to make any significant gains into Ukraine. But the reality is the Russian government is seeming to be increasingly desperate. And it seems that it is beginning to use tactics that are completely dishonest. Now, I have to be fully open. Russia has, throughout this entire conflict, even before it was a war and invasion, lied out of its mouth on a repeated basis. And nothing being said by the Russian government should or can be trusted. Primarily, Russia has established an evacuation corridor, what it calls a safe corridor, for the civilians and the citizens of Ukraine who want to leave, of Kiev, to be able to leave the city. Now, it should be noted that the civilians of Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities of Ukraine, which have been under siege, have been essentially living in basements or underground garages or other forms of bomb shelters during the last 4 days of this invasion. And the Russian military is claiming that it is creating safety corridors for these citizens to evacuate. Now, I'm just fully going to say that after Russia's blitzkrieg stopped working, it has been reported that Russia has began bombing residential houses, apartment buildings, hospitals, and schools. The Ukrainian government and other Ukrainian NGOs have been gathering evidence to eventually bring this to a human rights or war crimes court. Now, if I were a Ukrainian citizen, I would not evacuate, and I would be very, very suspicious of this Russian offer. It could potentially be a situation where Russia is enticing hundreds of thousands of people to go through this corridor and open fire on them, causing a massacre. At the end of the day, the only way Russia can win this conflict is by eliminating the Ukrainians which oppose their government. And Ukraine needs to stand strong and keep fighting until the Russian morale to fight is completely gone. I do not believe that this conflict is going to be resolved by any peace talk. And even if it is, that's just going to buy time. It could be a few months, it could be a few years, it could be a few decades or a few centuries until Russia attacks again.